worse than it would be if it was out in the open.
This is what happened in the initial wave of German bombings, when many of Stalingrad's buildings were hit for the first time. These impacts caused obvious damage, destroying roofs and burning out combustible wooden floorboards and fittings. But Haddon believes destruction like this left Stalingrad's buildings less vulnerable to subsequent bombings.
Where we have penetration, breaching of the roof and the walls of the structure, that can actually make things better by dissipating the effects of an internal explosion. This model is an example of what happens when an explosion takes place within a building that has got holes in it. The windows have been blown out or the roof's been blown away. The blast energy escapes out the side and it potentially does much less damage to the remaining parts of the structure. And this mirrors very well what I saw in the flour mill.
Damaged buildings, often little more than burnt-out shells, could take many more hits before collapsing. Without roofs, windows, or even floors, there were many holes through which blast could escape. Haddon's investigation shows that the bombing of Stalingrad, though terrible at first, actually had only limited effect. The city was not flattened, but transformed into a maze of partly ruined buildings which simply absorbed further impacts. And there was another consequence. Haddon has found that buildings often collapsed within their own footprints, surrounded by wide boulevards. For Red Army fighters, this created the perfect environment for defense. Buildings were adapted into individual strongpoints, fortresses of rubble and iron. Nazi forces found themselves engaged with a bitterly determined foe in a nightmarish environment created by their own bombing. It forced them reluctantly into a new kind of depraved warfare. The German blitzkrieg attack on Stalingrad was not effective enough. Mass bombing and shelling ruined, but not completely destroyed the city. So the German commander launched the 6th Army on a ground assault. General Friedrich Paulus assured Hitler that Stalingrad would fall before the end of September 1942. But months later, German troops still had not taken the city. Instead, they were enmeshed in a savage struggle for the maze of ruins, and victory seemed further away than ever.
For the German forces, Stalingrad was a puzzle. They did everything right. They reached the edge of Stalingrad, destroyed everything in their path, tanks, aircraft, they did the normal things. And then they got bogged down in Stalingrad.
After air power failed, the Germans turned to the mainstay of their ground forces, armor. In the initial invasion of Russia in summer 1941, Operation Barbarossa, German panzer divisions swept all Red Army resistance before them. But now in Stalingrad, it was a very different matter. Why were the Germans not more successful using tank attacks? David Fletcher is an expert on German armor of World War II.
Now, this is the Panzer IV. This is the tank which would have dominated the panzer divisions on the Eastern Front at the time of Stalingrad.
On the open plains of the Russian steppe, tanks like this were ideal for fast-moving blitzkrieg warfare. But David Fletcher thinks these tanks would have been less effective in Stalingrad.
Where these tanks come unstuck is fighting in an urban environment, and the more ruined that urban environment, the worse it is.
Rubble and wreckage made it hard for the tanks to maneuver. This made them easy targets. Worse still for the Germans, panzer crews were at a serious disadvantage when attacked by Russian troops firing from the upper stories of buildings.
The main armament is designed for horizontal firing. It doesn't have substantial elevation to deal with targets above the line of sight.
Problems like this meant that German commanders could no longer rely on armor to bear the brunt of their attacks. As the battle dragged on, what tanks the Germans did use fell victim to an entirely unexpected enemy. As conditions in Stalingrad worsened, the city became overrun with rats. German tanks became infested, and electrical wiring covered with fabric insulation was particularly vulnerable to hungry rodents.
You've got a short circuit, for example, in the electrics feeding the turret, and you've lost the immediate power for rapid turret traverse, you've lost whatever lighting you've got, and in many tanks you've actually lost the mechanism for firing the gun. And the effect of that is sufficient to render it completely incapable of fighting.
Whether they were put out of action in this way or were simply unsuited to the rubble-strewn environment, German tanks played little part in the battle for Stalingrad. Instead, the task fell to the highly trained grenadiers of the German infantry. By October 1942, after the first month of fighting, there were more than 100,000 German infantrymen engaged in the battle. But still, the breakthrough did not come.
In the war in the rubble, the Germans lose any technical advantage that they had, and it becomes down to small groups of men fighting one another. This is the first time they've had to fight this kind of urban warfare against a determined enemy. And it involves making up on the spot new tactics, new ways of dealing with how you cope with an entrenched enemy.
The German infantry hated this dirty close-quarter combat so much, they called it Rattenkrieg, or rat war. The harsh conditions in Stalingrad were the same for both sides. Yet as the fighting dragged on, the Germans found their Russian opponents showed no signs of weakening. How was it that poorly trained Russian troops were able to hold out against Hitler's Wehrmacht? Russian commanders knew they could not stand up to German attacks in the open. Instead, they had to find a way to even the odds. Damaged buildings were fortified and connected by a maze of trenches through the rubble. Red Army troops sheltered from German firepower in basements converted into bunkers. Oleg Bukovsky was a scout for raiding parties. His homegrown knowledge of the city made him an ideal guide. We used everything, even the sewer system beneath the city streets. Any place where it was possible to get through. We often marched through the sewage water in the tunnels, and it was so stinky and disgusting. The Russian commander, General Vasily Chuikov, coined a phrase for his soldiers' ingenuity in adapting to these tactics. He called it the Stalingrad Academy of Street Fighting. In this war of attrition, troops on both sides found that the bombed-out city was ideally suited to the infantryman's most dreaded opponent, the sniper.
The cities like Stalingrad, which had been pounded to rubble and ruin, were an absolute playground for snipers. Buildings half standing, half fallen down. There's almost an unlimited number of places a sniper could hide.
Martin Pegler of Britain's Royal Armouries has studied the German and Russian sniping tactics used in Stalingrad. The research has led him to suspect that the Soviets had the edge on their Nazi opponents. There was little to choose between the rifles that were used. The most vital piece of equipment was the telescopic sight, or scope.
The Russians put a lot of thought into the manufacture of their scopes, and they decided that these big old-fashioned turn-of-the-century hunting-type scopes were not really the way to be heading with optical technology. They came up with a much more compact, much more modern design.
But it wasn't as simple as just fixing the scope onto a weapon. Before going into action, the sniper had to be sure that the scope was properly prepared. The process is known as zeroing.
The whole point of zeroing a rifle is that when you put a scope onto it, you have to make sure that the point of impact of the bullet is exactly the same as where the crosshairs on the scope are. The only way to do that is to fire a few rounds through the rifle, and with each shot, you adjust your scope until the two meet perfectly.
Pegler believes that through this zeroing process, he may be able to show how the Soviets had an advantage.